You're raised as an athlete to fight back. So why all of a sudden when you retire do you stop the good fight?
This is Finding Center with Nick Hardwick.
I'm Nick Hardwick. I am husband to Jamie Hardwick. I am father of Teddy and Hudson, 6 and 4-year-old boys. I'm a former NFL center. I played 11 years for the San Diego Chargers, 5-time team captain. I retired in 2014 after the 2014 season. 11 years was more than enough wear and tear on the body. I immediately got into broadcasting, calling Charger games for 3 years before stepping down to do local sports talk radio. And now I'm a gym owner at Renegade Fit Camp. We're on 2 locations and rapidly expanding. I work out. I should say I train rather than work out. I train hard every day for the body because I like to train. It's just part of who I've become over the years playing professional sports. I'm a very physical human being, and I rely on that for my mental health, for my physical health, and for overall happiness. And as part of that, I have to take care of my body from the inside out with a good dose of protein every day. I like good, healthy fats, and BUBS is a big part of my daily routine. Every single day, I don't usually eat until noon because I wake up at 3:30. I hit that brew button on the coffee machine. I wait till the pot is made, pour myself a nice cup, 2 scoops of the collagen protein, 1 heaping scoop of the MCT oil powder, which I have to say is absolutely the best product on the market. It's ridiculously good. But that fuels me from work from 6 to 9 a.m. when I get off of the radio. I go straight from there immediately to Renegade Fit Camp, get my workout in, and I don't eat again until noon. And I never feel hungry, and this is a big part of the reason why. Good.
Joining us today on the Finding Center podcast is Dr. Kirk Parsley. Doc is a Navy SEAL, turned MD, turned doctor to the Navy SEALs, and is now best known as a world-leading performance sleep doctor. Tons of information can be found on him at docparsley.com, including his sleep remedy, which he put me on years ago. So today we're going to take a deep dive into hormone replacement therapy, with Doc Parsley's real specialty being endocrinology. When is the right time, if ever, for me? What are the potential risks associated? Do athletes and former military members potentially have a greater need for this therapy? And when, if ever, should females consider hormone replacement therapy? All of that and a lot more with Dr. Parsley coming up. Doc Parsley, what's happening?
Not much, man. Just living the repeat, I think.
Life's good in 2020?
Yeah, it's all good.
Yeah, big plans?
No. Same old stuff,
Keep plugging along.
Better, bigger, better, faster, stronger, smarter, of whatever I'm already doing.
One day better.
Yeah, one day better. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I always say, I'm not as good today as I will be tomorrow.
Perfect.
Kind of a family motto here. I've been trying to beat it into my boys' heads.
Yeah.
I'm not as good today as I will be tomorrow. Yeah.
So maybe just
it allows
beat them more.
Beat them, yes.
Yeah.
It allows for errors in the day. I know I'm going to fail today, but I'm going to get up tomorrow, and I'm going to work, and I'm going to strive, and I'm going to be a little bit better.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
And when you fall down today, you can just go, it's no big deal.
No big deal.
Tomorrow I'll be able to
You
do
wait
it.
till tomorrow.
Yeah, you wait
it's
till
like
tomorrow.
Old school Cubs fan.
Right.
It's like, wait till next year. Or I guess now it's like a new Charger fan. It's
Yeah.
like, wait till next year.
Yeah.
I get tons of questions from my former football friends, civilians who are now entering their 40s, 50s, considering getting on hormone replacement therapy.
Yep.
What do people need to know about HRT?
Well, I mean, I think the most important thing to know about HRT is that the majority of people don't. The majority of doctors or healthcare providers doing it, and I don't have the statistic, but from my personal experience and working with other doctors and with my clients, is the majority of healthcare providers don't really know what they're doing with that. It's a much more complex system than people give it credit for. So you see, silly commercials on television about low T, and ask your doctor if you might need testosterone or something. Yeah, I mean, your doctor knows enough to know what testosterone is, and maybe or maybe he's one of these docs who's taking a weekend course, or she, and it's like, oh yeah, just give him testosterone. Well, it doesn't exist in isolation, right? I mean, there's, testosterone is formed from cholesterol. There's about 27 steps in between testosterone and cholesterol. And a lot of those are metabolically active. So you can't just give one end product and go, there, done, right? And then, your testosterone affects every other hormone. So your testosterone affects what it, what it changes into. So it aromatizes into estrogen, estradiol. It has an enzymatic reaction where it can become dihydrotestosterone, which is super anabolic to everything except muscles, and it's what causes bad skin and hair loss and prostate enlargement and the kind of the negative side effects of having testosterone. And all of that stuff has to be balanced. And so when I work, when I've worked with people, and I learned hormone replacement therapy from a lot of different docs, but the first guy that I worked with is a guy named Dr. Edward Lichten, and he was a obstetrician, gynecologist who had been doing female hormone replacement for 40 some odd years. So he was in his mid to late 60s probably when I met him. And about 20 years before that, sorry about that. About 20 years before I met him, one of his clients brought in, she was feeling so good on her hormone replacement therapy. She said, can you do something with my husband? She brought her husband in, and he was like, I don't know. So he started doing testosterone replacement way before anybody else did. But he's a very, I guess, sort of research-oriented guy. So he just went full retard studying before he did any of this. And so he had been doing it, probably 20 years before Cenogenics and those guys kind of became the first guys to do that. So I trained with him, and a lot of how I think about it is based off of working with him, and I went and trained with all these other fly-by-night industries who give certifications in hormone replacement therapy, and it was just drastically incomplete. And I think of it a lot like nutrition, right? If somebody eats McDonald's every day, and they go talk to somebody about cleaning up their diet, and they start eating a mediocre instead of a terrible diet, they feel better, and they're like, well, totally worked for me, dude. But what if you actually ate a good diet? So going from crap to mediocre is pretty easy,
Right.
and a lot of people, by the time they go see their doctors for hormone replacement therapy, they're already feeling like crap. So doing anything is going to get them up to mediocre, and they go, it's usually
that's good enough.
Yeah, it's usually like the first 6 months, it's a big transformation for them. Like, man, I feel so much better, and then they kind of plateau out. Like, yeah, I mean, still feel better than I felt then, but it's not really going anywhere from here. And it really shouldn't be that way. I mean, if obviously we've all damaged our bodies, so there's going to be some limitations as to how agile and rubber you're going to feel.
Right.
Like you're not going to be 19 again. You're not going to be able to, like, wreck a skateboard in the street and get up and.
Yeah, I wasn't planning on that.
Yeah, I mean, just like, but as far as your physiology, if you replace all the hormones to a youthful level, why would you really be that difference? I mean, there's some DNA aging and some cellular aging, and those types of things exist, but those aren't that perceptible probably until 60s and 70s and things like that.
So if people out there are thinking about this, who should they go to? Who's qualified, who's unqualified to put you on a high level program?
Wow.
Probably more.
I should have saw that one coming.
Probably more who's qualified than who's unqualified, because I'm assuming a decent amount of people are unqualified.
Yeah.
Even your MD.
Yeah. I guess I would just do my due diligence and find somebody who probably just does that, or that's
their sole focus.
Like it's at least a major part of their practice. What you see a lot with these little strip mall clinics is these are like ER doctors and stuff who are just picking up an extra shift. They go out and they learn, they go get their certification, and then they do shifts in this place, it's not their profession. They don't have a passion for it. So it's usually going to be somebody who's not a traditional medical person. Like, and this is observation. There's no cause and effect here. This is just purely my observation. It's going to be somebody who's really heavily invested in alternative plans. So somebody probably into functional medicine, integrative medicine. A lot of naturopaths do it. I don't know what all states they're allowed to do it in. There's a really good naturopath out here in La Jolla that I know. I guess it's arrogant to say he's really good. I mean, his protocols are a lot like mine, so
Okay.
I feel like he's really good.
Good.
When I met him and we started talking.
Who's that?
His name is Bronner Handwerger.
Yes.
You know him?
Yes.
Yeah. So he and I met at a symposium 5 or 6 years ago. Well, probably longer than that at this point, 8 years ago maybe. And found out we were both in San Diego, and we just started talking about hormones, and turns out, there's about 90% overlap with what he does and I do. And he learned it from a totally different source and comes at it from a different angle and came to the same conclusions, which is sort of validating for me.
And that's through a lot, I'm assuming, trial and error with patients and figuring out what's working and what's not working.
Right. And you have to have, a lot of it is just based on your patient population. So some patients are really good in that, they do exactly what you tell them to, and they give you a lot of feedback. Some patients just take whatever you give them, and they kind of do that, and then you don't hear from them again until the next time they come in, usually with a problem. So he, I won't say anything about his patient population as to who they are, but he works with a lot of really motivated guys.
How do I know when it's time to get on?
That's a good question. I think,
Or I guess what should go into the decision?
well, so I would say if you're under 40, it's different. If you're a professional athlete, if you're like, one of the things that I found when I was working with the SEALs is they all had terrible hormones. All their anabolic hormones were really low. All their catabolic hormones were really high. And some of these guys were only in their late 20s and early 30s. I think that's exceptional. those are people who are really beating themselves, but
Right.
NFL athletes would probably fall into that. I remember doing blood work on you, and,
Yes.
and going, Jesus, like you don't have any testosterone. How are you so big and strong?
How's this working?
Yeah,
Willpower.
yeah. And so obviously at that point, you felt like you would have needed that, and it just wasn't an option for
Yes.
you in your career because it was banned by
Couldn't.
your job.
Can't
right?
do anything.
So you weren't allowed to do that, which was tragic. I was so upset about that whole thing. I'm going, man, you're killing this guy so that he can be an entertainer, and play
Yes.
a game. That seemed ridiculous to me, but I understand why they have to do what they do.
Of course. Yeah, because then it's like
It's a slippery slope. You start doing this guy, and then
it's an arms race, right?
Right.
One guy does it, the backup has to do it, he does more,
Right.
the defensive line has to do
Right.
it to be able to compete, and then it's just like you've got a bunch of
Then
monsters out
they
there
have a bunch
running
of
around.
bulls on the field.
Exactly
bunch of
right.
myostatin knockout bulls.
Then it probably looks like the 80s in the NFL. I think 1987 was when they first started testing.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I never thought of that, but when I was a kid, they didn't test. Since
Yeah.
I would have been 17 when they started testing.
So here's a big thing, and this is partly we learned this during last season of the Finding Center podcast. There was a huge Harvard former football player health study done,
Yeah.
and it directly linked players to lower testosterone, erectile dysfunction, to concussive episodes.
Yep.
So studies of military vets, boxers, and even civilians with concussive episodes showed similar results.
Right.
What's the theory on that?
Well, there's different regions of the brain being affected, but the gist of it, so the military is twofold: military law enforcement, and even some athletes. Like I've done a lot of sleep consulting for professional baseball teams because they travel so much, and so
What a wonky
Right.
schedule they have, playing
So-
late at night.
right. So when you start running into sleep deprivation, you run into hormonal dysregulation as well. I don't think it's as big of a problem for the NFL.
It's not, no.
But so though, that's one aspect of it. It's a big aspect of it in military and law enforcement because you have shift workers that are working, from midnight to 8 a.m. every single night of their life. Like they do that for 20 years. That's really bad for their health, right? Because even if they're getting adequate sleep, they're getting it at the wrong time of the day, and doesn't have the same benefit. So that's causing their anabolic hormones to be low. But also, what most people don't realize is that, all of your hormonal regulation, so how much of any hormone you have is regulated by your brain. And so when you start inflaming the brain, you start interfering with the pathways that are doing the sensing and the pathways that are doing the responsing, or the responsive aspect to the to the sensing of the hormones. So if you have a concussion, that leads to inflammation, right? And then that inflammation causes pressure in your head, and that pressure leads to decreased blood flow. Well, if you have chronic inflammation, like you have a chronic inflammation in your joint or anything else like that, your body starts protecting against this chronic inflammation, and you kind of start walling all this off. In your joints, you tend to do it with calcium, and that's what bone spurs are. It's just calcified tendons and ligaments. And it's like rock candy. If you get that mobility back and start moving and get rid of inflammation, you can break all that calcium off.
That is kind of the conundrum of arthritis, right? You got to continue to move through.
Right. I was at Kona, and there's this guy who's, I want to say he's like 84 years old, and I think he's done Kona like every year except for 1 year because he was sick.
Full Ironman. 84 years old.
And there was an interview in the paper, and they said, don't your knees wear out? He said, no, hell no. I use them every day. and he thought it was the strangest question. Like I use them so much they can't break down. Why would they get old on me? Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. So anyway, when you have inflammation in the brain, that starts walling it off, and you put like protective proteins in there, which are actually sort of damaging, and you actually decrease permanently regions of blood flow to the brain, and you just start changing the neurochemistry of the brain, and you can actually damage the pituitary stalk as well, which is really more common with the types of concussions that football players and pugilists get. Like military gets.
Where is the pituitary?
It's basically right between your eyes this way, and just like a little behind your eyes, like kind of right over maybe the palate of your mouth. So like right back there.
Oh yeah, totally makes sense.
Yeah,
that's where all the damage comes.
And it's from the profile, it kind of looks like testicles,
Sure.
But there's this little gap in the brain where the stalk comes down, and then you have this bulb sort of at the bottom, and you have an anterior and a posterior that secrete different hormones, but they're usually hormone releasing factors. And if you rattle that enough, because it's inside of a little bony cave, I think it's called the sella turcica, Turkish saddle, and it's like this little bony structure, but it has this stalk, and so when it beats back and forth, you can actually inflame that stalk. And now, when your brain senses right above that, it senses how many hormones you have, and then there's a response that tells the pituitary what to do. Well, if that's all inflamed and you're affecting blood flow to that, then you don't get that.
And the pituitary then signals to the gonads to release testosterone?
Right. So So LH and FSH are the gonadal pre-hormones. So luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone. So in men, the luteinizing hormone lead to the release of testosterone, and the follicular stimulating hormones will lead to sperm production. So women have the same thing. Their ovaries and testicles are exactly the same organ. It's just during embryogenesis, in the male, those ovaries slip out of the body into an ugly little sac, and those are testicles. And if they stay up in there, they're ovaries. But they really have the same responses to the FSH and LSH. And that's how you know if a woman is menopausal, is you can look at her FSH, and it goes off the charts essentially once her ovaries quit producing ovums, fertilizable eggs, and menstruating, and their estrogen levels obviously go down.
Guys, we'll get back to the podcast in just a moment, but first we have a little bit of breaking news. This important PSA is brought to you by manscaped.com. This is your pubic service announcement. Wait,
It's that public service and the pubic service announcement. After more than 18 months of research and development, the Manscaped engineering team has confirmed that they have successfully created the greatest ball hair trimmer that has ever existed. You men out there, you ladies out there looking for a gift for your men, maintenance is key. The new trimmer was just released only moments ago. We are the first to confirm the new and improved Lawnmower 3.0 manscaping trimmer is now available for purchase. Don't miss out on this. Get 20% off and free shipping with the code BELIEVE, BLEAV, at manscaped.com. That's 20% off with free shipping at manscaped.com, and use the code BELIEVE, BLEAV. And as always, your balls will thank you.
Well, we'll get to the women and HRT. Acceptable ranges for men. And I know like general acceptable ranges are different than somebody who's trying to be optimal.
Right.
Where do those fall when it comes to testosterone? And I realize that it is its own ecosystem.
Yeah.
It's like you can't just look at T and say, take that number by itself.
Right. Well, again, like I was saying at the beginning, there's a complex of things to consider. So you have testosterone itself. And like I said, testosterone can become estradiol, and testosterone can become dihydrotestosterone. And then DHEA is a precursor to testosterone. And when you have hormones floating around in the blood, they don't just float around by themselves, by and large. Almost everything in the blood is escorted by some sort of protein, a carrier protein. And for hormones, that's called sex hormone binding globulin. Which just means that it's a protein that binds sex hormones. So you have to look at that number as well. So a lot of places will do your total testosterone, and let's say, and let me give one caveat about the reference ranges. They used to call them normal ranges. They had nothing to do with normalcy; they were usual, and so eventually they changed their wording around to call them reference ranges. Unfortunately, what a lot of labs will do is they will start, they will look at their data and they will readjust their reference ranges based on the population that they have. So maybe every 1,000 or 10,000 labs they do, if the natural set point seems to be lower, then they lower the reference ranges to capture the usual, which is then considered the normal. When this all started. It started with Framingham data, and they found normal ranges. So Framingham was like this little town in Massachusetts where nobody really moved in or out, and it was big enough to be statistically significant, but they had sort of a captured population, and they weren't doing anything about it. They were just testing their blood regularly. And when a new lab test came out, they kind of gave it to this whole area, and then they just followed them, just watched what happened. And that's where the cholesterol numbers come from, and that's where testosterone numbers come from, and normal blood markers like red blood cells and hemoglobin, hematocrit, it all comes from that. And so the inclusion criteria to be normal in Framingham was you had to be 19 or older, you had to have testicles, and you had to be alive. That was
normal.
That was normal.
Yeah.
And so then they tested it, and that's where they came up with normal for them. So everybody's kind of scrambling now to go, okay, well, that's usual maybe, or that's okay, or that's
you're alive.
It's frequent, but that's not optimal. Like, what's optimal? So I only say that to point out that we don't have really solid data to say this is what's optimal. Now, the ideal thing would be is if I knew what your hormones were like when you were 25 and you came to see me and you're 45, and I can go, we'd go back to that.
Let's match that up.
Right. That almost never happens, right? So
word of advice, if you've got somebody in your life who may be 25, is go get them tested now.
Yeah,
keep a backlog of your blood work and your numbers and kind of track it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think everything will be a lot easier to find, 20 years from now, because electronic medical records and all that. I mean, I don't have a single medical document from my life, pre, 35 or 40 or something, and most people don't. But I think the 25-year-olds now will have
all of that.
They'll have everything. So but it is probably worth asking for that test. Just say, hey, I want to get my baseline so that when I'm 45 or 50, I know what I was like when I was 25.
What about these ones that I'm seeing like advertised on Instagram and social media that you can get your blood work checked? Is that sufficient?
I don't know what those are. I haven't seen those.
Okay.
I don't really go on social media if I can help it.
Good for you. Wise man.
But you know, the most important thing is to get the right markers, and it's not so much. So if I sent your lab, if I drew your blood right now and sent it out to 3 different labs, I'd get 3 different answers, right? It won't be. It depends on how what techniques they're using to study, to evaluate for whatever they're looking for. And it depends on how long it's been sitting there and how much is coagulated and the competence of the lab tech who's doing it. There's a lot of things. So they would be close. They should be relatively close. But a lot of them will use different techniques, and a lot of them will have different reference ranges. So one would say, well, normal testosterone is between 250 and 1100, and you're 900 through that. One would say, well, normal testosterone is between 300 and 800, and you're high. And and all of that would exist. So I wouldn't, and the thing is that it wouldn't really matter which lab you took as long as you stayed with that one.
Okay.
But if I do one lab now, 3 months from now, I use a different lab and they have a different reference range and a different technique, I'm not really comparing apples to apples.
Okay.
So what I base mine off of is the chair of UCLA, the chair of endocrinology at UCLA, and I always blank on his name. It's like a word. It's a letter salad. It's some crazy
Okay.
some crazy last name I can't ever remember. But people could look it up. It was I think he might still be the department, the endocrine chair. But it was in probably the 2005 range, somewhere around there. He published a study that was done, I think, between UCLA and Harvard, and what they did is they measured the testosterone of thousands of men. I think like 30,000 men or something like that. You looking it up?
Any of these? Can you see?
It's an older guy.
And maybe he's
He
since
might be
moved on.
gone. Yeah. I wanted to say it was kind of like a Germanic or something.
Okay.
Like it had a bunch. I'll send it to you.
Not a lot of vowels.
Not a lot of vowels.
Yes.
A few Y's and some X's.
Maybe
and
a Z,
Z's
yeah.
and some stuff like that. Anyway, what they did is they took the bell curve and I want to say 30,000 is coming to mind. I haven't read that study in 20 years, 10 years, 15 years. But they took the bell curve and then they just watched what happened to men. They weren't doing anything about it. And what they found over the course of 10 years or something like that, if they broke the bell curve down into quintiles, so 20%, right? The people in the men who were in the top 20% or the first quintile, they had the lowest risk of any disease and the lowest risk of death from any cause.
No kidding.
And then
they had the highest testosterone.
They had the highest testosterone. So they were all within normal limits. They were all within the reference ranges, but they were the top 20% of everybody that they tested.
Okay.
Right? And then the next group down, you go down 20%, their risk doubled. And then
Cardiovascular disease.
every disease.
Yeah, everything.
Yeah. So it's called morbidity, mortality, like the indices for that. It's like what, so they were 2 times more likely to die than the first quintile. And they're 2 times more likely to have diabetes or, have a stroke or any kind of disease that you can think of, rheumatoid arthritis,
Yes.
like anything autoimmune, anything like that. So they were twice as likely. You go down another quintile, they were twice as likely as the one before that. So now they're 4 times more than the first one.
Wow.
You go to another quintile and now they're twice as much. They're 8 times more likely to have any disease or die from any cause.
All cause mortality.
Yeah. So I'm like, all right, well, if that doesn't close the door on this, I don't know what does. And so that's always been my approach, is to stay up when I'm looking at testosterone. Now,
Yeah, because we're not talking about putting somebody on bodybuilding levels
Right.
of testosterone
Right.
and
that,
hormones
that
that are
needs to
going
be,
to. You're not going to turn into Dorian Yates
right.
just because you're getting hormone replacement therapy.
Right. And you're not going to turn into Dorian Yates no matter how much you take.
It doesn't matter. That's true.
But that's another thing people don't understand. But what's really important to understand is the difference between hormone replacement therapy and taking steroids, as it's commonly referred to. It's all in the dose, right? Toxicity is all in the dose.
Yes.
And so
with everything.
Right. So the difference. It's a conceptually completely different thing. So what you're doing as an athlete, or especially a bodybuilder or maybe a power strength athlete, is you're trying to have a higher level of testosterone than you would have ever been able to achieve on your own. When you're doing hormone replacement therapy, we're trying to give you what you would be able to produce optimally. So
and in effect, lower all-cause mortality.
Right. And we can't say that's true because that study hasn't been done, but it's very likely to be true. I mean, it makes a lot of sense.
Sure.
Cognitively, it creates very little cognitive dissonance in me to say, well, I think that if I have youthful hormones, I'm more likely to perform as though I'm youthful.
Which is the great fear, I think, of people when they're thinking about hormone replacement therapy is that, I'm going to give myself cancer, or I'm going to give myself a heart attack, or you see like the Lou Ferrignos of the world that end up passing, not Lou Ferrignos, one of the football players that played
Lyle
for the
Alzado.
Lyle Alzados of the world, that you're thinking about that kind of.
Yeah, he blamed his brain tumor on testosterone.
Right.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
and then in the public, you just hear these little snippets and you don't really understand how complex the system is, and you don't understand the studies that have gone into it. So I guess the question when you're thinking about this, it's like, should I get on it and should I not, is maybe if you're not in the first 20 percentile of that, is the risk of not being on hormone replacement therapy greater than being the risk of being on hormone replacement therapy? Yeah.
I mean, and in my argument, and again, when I say this stuff, I'm speaking from a layman's standpoint. But if there were scientific evidence to say that the study's been done, then I would say here's the proof. The studies are never going to be done. It's too expensive, and who's going to pay for it, right? The pharmaceutical industry, not going to pay for it. So who's going to pay for the study? What's anybody's motivation to study it other than the intellectual curiosity of finding it? And then that answer will just get buried because there's a lot of social stigma around hormone replacement therapy. Yeah. But if you look at that bell curve, you look at that study and go, okay, well, this is my lowest risk of disease and death. And they will find healthcare practitioners, and specifically doctors, probably more than anybody, who will tell you that you're risking cancer, you're risking whatever. For a long time, they were saying that testosterone was associated with prostate cancer, and if you give people testosterone, you give them prostate cancer. It turns out to be exactly the opposite. The people who have prostate cancer almost always have the lowest levels of testosterone, the highest levels of estrogen. And it makes sense, right? And so to that argument as to whether or not there's danger to using hormone replacement therapy and making yourself physiologically 25 years old again, is that dangerous? Well, is it dangerous to be 25 years old, right? Are you healthier when you're 25? Or are you healthier when you're 50?
I'd like to do 25 all over.
Right. So if you could stay physiologically 25, why wouldn't you? And if having high testosterone levels led to prostate cancer, why don't 25-year-olds have prostate cancer? Why do 70-year-olds have prostate cancer? Right. So it doesn't logically make sense. And then the studies have been done. And in fact, Edward Lichten, the guy I studied with, he did a study at University of Michigan, and essentially proved that theory, like straight out, is that every prostate cancer patient they had the lowest levels of testosterone and the highest levels of estradiol. What happens, though, is because of the type of tissue that is an androgen receptive tumor quite frequently. And by that, I mean maybe 15% of the time. So if somebody has undetected prostate cancer and you give them an androgen like testosterone, you expose that cancer, because now you've kind of fueled that thing, and now they're going to be able to detect it. And that's why they thought that it caused prostate cancer. It's because it was revealing cancers that already existed but were too low.
But it's not causal.
It's not causal.
Gotcha.
And if anything, it's the opposite. And that's turning out to be true for women with breast cancer as well, right? Because it, there are estrogen sensitive breast tumors, and therefore when they have a lot of estrogen around, that tumor grows. But if estrogen caused breast cancer, then young women should have breast cancer more frequently than old women.
Right.
Right. And
yeah.
So
let's get into that, because I know for females, and you talked about the doctor you studied under working for a long time, almost exclusively with females. Hormone therapy used to be very common, but then it did go out of rage because of the concern of causing breast cancer, which you've talked about.
The Women's Healthcare Initiative, which was the worst study that has ever been done, and had the largest negative impact on society of anything that I'm aware of. And what happened with that study, it was I think it was the nurses' trial is what it was called, maybe the nurses' trial was the precursor to this, but it's the Women's Healthcare Initiative, and they tracked all these women, and they came up with this. They came up with this soundbite that estrogen replacement therapy specifically caused breast cancer, and everybody was like, "Oh my gosh, that's and it scared." I think 50% of the women in America on hormone replacement therapy went off immediately within the first 3 months,
because you can't get that out of your head,
right? And everyone believed it. Well, what happened was, the company sponsoring this was Wyeth, and they produced a product called PrimPro, and it was Premarin, which is horse urine. It's like a pregnant horse. They distill the estrogen essentially out of that horse's urine, and then Provera, which was a progesterone analog. So it's a chemical that kind of looks like progesterone, and it has progesterone-like effects in your body. Well, it was made out of petroleum. And it was banned in every country in the entire world except America and France, I think, or maybe French Canadian or like something. And so they did this study, and that was the research arm. It was the PrimPro. Now, what they found is that there was an increased risk of cancer in that group, and specifically breast cancer, but it was all cancers increased. But that's the one that really scared people with. Well, it turns out the reason it was banned everywhere is because everyone knew that it was carcinogenic, and that's why no one had.
That's petroleum.
It's a petroleum-based product that you're putting in your body. Now, there was 2 years after that trial, and they actually stopped that trial and put this out as like an urgent healthcare report. That this is what we found, and it was becoming too dangerous to keep the trial going. So they stopped the trial and let this out, and everybody jumped off. About 2 years later, they released the control arm, which was just Premarin, and this was just distilled horse urine. And now we can do bioidentical. We can basically take a beaker and we can make the exact hormone that your body is going to make, and we can make it in an enzymatic reaction. We can grow it really fast, and then we can distill it, and it's perfect, and it looks just. But the Premarin, that was as close as we had in this day. That was equine urine distillation, and that arm actually had lower cancer rates than everybody else. Nobody said anything about it. Didn't get any publicity whatsoever. And then right around that same time, there had been dozens of researchers who had gone back through the research trial and looked at it for errors, and they'd all come up with this same thing. Well, it was the Provera that was causing this, and also the way you did your statistics here was a little wonky. You were actually you're reporting this in an inverted manner. So and I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was like I don't know. So let's say that there were five people out of every 1,000, or 5 people out of every 10,000 had cancer. I'm making that number up, and then they say so five out of every 10,000 have cancer, and now you say, well, it went from 5 to 6, right? And you go, okay, well, what's one more out of 10,000? That doesn't seem like that big of a jump. But then they say, oh, no, it's 20%, right? Because it's it's
you're
1
doing
out
the
of 5. You're
percentage
adding
increase.
Right.
Yes.
So they came out with some ridiculous number, like it was 25 or 30% more likely. But when you
which
look
is really
back,
common, by the way.
Yeah, and it was like 2 more out of every 100,000, but it decreased heart attacks by more than that. So like overall, if you took that total cohort, you were still less likely to die. But anyway, it was a very poorly done trial. There's been lots of retractions of the various information in there published, but nothing gets the attention that the sensationalistic initial drop gets.
One of the common statistical things too to be able to do is like the magic hand is to go a 20 or 30% increase or a 20 or 30% decrease. I mean, that's like the easiest thing you could do, and people just see the numbers and it's like, whoa, but you're talking 5 to 6 out of 10,000. I mean, not that those were the given numbers, but that's very common.
It's very common. You have to know what the denominator is, and the media is
they're brilliant,
very prone to not giving you a denominator. Like they'll say, if it fits their agenda, they'll say, whatever, lightning strikes have doubled this year. 2 people got hit instead of 1.
Right.
If you look over the course of 20 years, it's like it averages out to 1 a year.
Sure.
But this year it was 2, and last year it was 0, and like, it's
stick around. We'll give you the whole story later.
Right.
What age should women start thinking about hormone therapy? Or what's a common range?
I think for women, I would start looking, and so when I say hormone therapy, I'm not necessarily talking about hormone replacement therapy. Okay. So like for men, and we didn't really get into this, but for men, a lot of times I'll just I can give them supplements that will decrease the amount of estrogen that they're converting to, and you can give them.
You would start there?
I would start there for younger men if I believed that I'd be able to get them into that first quintile without giving them hormones. Okay. Now women, so when I say hormone replacement therapy, I'm talking about all of that, like any intervention to kind of get them in the top. Because even a 45-year-old man, a lot of the times I can give him other pharmaceuticals that will cause his body to produce more testosterone, and I can block his conversion to estrogen, I can block his conversion to dihydrotestosterone, and I can get him up into that top 20%. And another thing, I never answered your question very well, but there are a lot of things to look at, and I'm using total testosterone as a simple way to talk about this. I'm much more concerned with free testosterone than I am total. And that's what
because that's the active portion.
That's the active portion. And the other is bound to these sex hormone binding globulins I was talking about, these proteins that it irreversibly bind. So if testosterone binds to that, it goes to your liver, it all gets chopped up and made into other stuff, and you don't get that testosterone molecule anymore. So if you have a lot of sex hormone binding globulin, it doesn't matter what your total is because your free could still suck, right? So you could have a total of 1,000 and only have like 1% free instead of 3% free, and you're still low, right? So in women start losing testosterone at about 35 years old. That's one of the markers for that is cellulite, because testosterone sets neuromuscular tension, and so like the little attachments between your skin and your muscle actually have like a little contractile tone into that, and as some of those lengthen out, that skin polyps away, and the other attachments, which is more fascial and doesn't have any sort of tensioning material in it, right? Those will. And it's the opposite of goosebumps, right? And so what happens is that stays in place and everything around it relaxes, and it causes a little fat dimple there. But you didn't actually gain any fat. You just released the tension between your skin and the fascia beneath it. And the goosebumps are the opposite. Is everything sucks down, and the one thing that stays up is kind of the little goosebump bit. So that's just a anecdotal observation. I wouldn't base it on, hey, I have cellulite. I have
sure, but it's something to think about.
But so women...
we used to, and this is a weird thing, but guys in the locker room, and me being one of them, had little dimples on my butt. It's not surprisingly, when you go look at the numbers, like, dude.
Right, exactly. And
funny, my strength coach used to always be like, he would say my hips look like I had a lot of estrogen. He's like, you got a lot of estrogen.
Right,
I was like, yeah, I do.
Yeah. So for the women, I would say, it tends to be somewhere around 35 years old as they start running into a decrease in testosterone, because women's ovaries are actually where their testosterone comes from, but it's also where their estrogen comes from. So there's this enzyme In men, it's in our subcutaneous fat. So the fat that's on the outside of our muscles.
Under the skin.
Yeah, so under the skin. So what you see when you see a fat person.
Yeah.
And that has an enzyme in it called aromatase, which converts testosterone into estrogen. And so the fatter you are, this is Mother Nature's big joke, right? The fatter you are, the more aromatase you have, which means more of your testosterone is going to become estrogen, which means you're going to get even fatter.
What a catch-22 that is.
And it gets even worse because the brain has very few testosterone receptors, and the hypothalamus is the region that reads how many hormones you have in your, like how much of a hormone you have in your blood. The true sensor in your brain for how much testosterone you have is how much estrogen you have. And men too. So when you have a lot of fat producing a lot of estrogen, and that estrogen is in your bloodstream going to your brain, your hypothalamus is going, oh, we must have a ton of testosterone because we have a ton of estrogen. So we don't need to release any more luteinizing hormone to make the testicles make more testosterone because we have all this estrogen and we're obviously high. And so it's a self-propagating downward spiral. For women, it's similar, but they have the aromatase enzyme is in the tissue that encases their ovaries. So as their ovaries produce testosterone, it becomes estrogen, and by the time it gets in their bloodstream, except for when they're really young, their ovaries produce more than that tissue around it can convert, and that's what leads to sort of their residual testosterone in their system. Well, if you understand that that's the mechanism of that they're getting testosterone is basically producing more testosterone than their enzymes can convert, as soon as they drop a little bit, what's the first thing they're losing? They're losing testosterone, and they're going to have they're still going to have good estrogen levels for another 10 or 15 years probably, but their testosterone goes out the window right away. And again, they don't necessarily need like a testosterone cream or something, but they might. But a lot of times you can improve that with something like dihydro or something like DHEA. You can give a supplement of that. That converts to testosterone. You can block a little bit of testosterone conversion with zinc, and sometimes you give that to a woman and that's all she needs, and she'll her testosterone again. I go for, in males or females, my protocol is always to reach for that upper quintile, that upper 20 to 25% of everything anabolic, and the lower 20 to 25% of anything catabolic. And that's
that keeps you in the safe range.
Yeah, and that just really puts you, that's what a 25-year-old would look like if they came into my clinic.
How much does it help with perimenopause and regular menopause?
So the biggest complaints from menopause is the hot flashes.
Yes.
And the hot flashes, that's actually caused by a luteal surge. So that's when your pituitary is secreting out a lot of luteinizing hormone to try to get your ovaries to produce more estrogen. That's what's causing the hot flashes. Now, the only way that I'm aware of to prevent that luteal surge from happening is to have enough estrogen in your system to where that luteal surge doesn't happen. And it feeds back to the brain that there's plenty of estrogen, like we're talking about in the example of the men. There's plenty of estrogen, so your hypothalamus doesn't tell your pituitary to secrete a bunch of luteinizing hormone. As far as I know, there's no other way to block the hot flash, to block that luteal surge. Now, not every woman obviously responds to the luteal surge the same way. So some women have that surge and it doesn't cause them to get hot flashes. So what are their true symptoms of menopause other than feeling older, right? And older is just slower, fatter, dumber, and colder, which is really just hormones. It's really poor sleep and poor hormones.
And that goes for men and women.
That's men and women.
Slower, fatter, dumber, colder.
Yeah,
I like that.
I mean, that's really what we're saying, right?
Yeah.
When we're getting older, it's like
that's right.
And not to get off topic, but there's a really strong correlation with when people start sleeping poorly and when people start accelerating their aging process. So that happens hand in hand around 60 years old.
Which one's the chicken? Which one's the egg?
Yeah,
with hormones and sleep.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm sure it's.
I mean,
it is that kind of question.
Yeah,
right?
when we studied it in the military, we found an almost perfect correlation in men with total testosterone and time of sleep. Meaning that if they had high testosterone levels, they slept well. If they had low testosterone levels, they slept poorly. If we took away their sleep, their testosterone went low. If we gave them more sleep, their testosterone went up. And it wasn't a 1-to-1, but
there wasn't a way.
It was like 0.87 or 0.82 to 1 or something like that.
And there wasn't a way in the military because
same
guys
thing.
are tested as you can't
and that's
give them.
It's all banned as
Right.
well. So, and to finish off that one thought that we never got to, that reminds me is, when men get hormone replacement therapy, they're shooting to get to 25-year-old kind of range, right? That sort of sweet spot in that top 20%. Well, the average male's testicles will produce between 75 and 125 milligrams in a week. And that's being pulsatile. I mean, most of it's secreted while you're asleep. Most of it's secreted during deep sleep, but there's some pulsatile secretions during the day, and you can exercise and change that a little bit. So, let's go to the upper limit, 125 milligrams. Well, how many people do 125 milligrams a week? Almost no one. You go to these testosterone clinics, they're giving you at least 200 milligrams a week, sometimes 300 or 400 milligrams a week. Now you're getting to the testosterone replacement that bodybuilders and athletes are doing.
Okay.
You're going super physiologic. You're going outside of the normal range. And there's a big expense to that. And there's, in fact, a big expense to
Physiological expense?
Yeah,
Okay.
we'll talk about that in just a second. And there's, in fact, a big expense to just doing weekly injections. So if you think about it, let's say 125 is roughly like 17 milligrams per day that your testicles are producing over the course of 7 days. Well, if you take 200 all at once, what do you think your overall level would be if I tested you right then?
200.
No, that's just 200. That's how many milligrams
gotcha.
are going into your skin. But if I looked at
it's
measured in nanograms per deciliter. So how much testosterone would you have floating around your blood? It'd probably be like 2,000 with a normal reference range of being 1,000 at the top, right? Maybe even 3,000. Like, it would be super high. Well, you have receptors for that testosterone. They can cross through the membranes of the cells because they're fat soluble, they're lipids, right? So they can cross through the membranes, but they still need a receptor inside the cell to be able to do their work at the nucleus. They affect transcription of DNA. And if you lose androgen receptors, we can call them testosterone receptors. They're called androgen. But if you lose the receptor for testosterone, then it doesn't matter how much testosterone you have because you can't use it, right? Just like if you have a lot of those binding globulins, you can't use it either.
Right.
So you either have so many of these binders that you can't use it, or you don't have any of the keyholes that the key fits, and it doesn't work whatsoever. So what happens anytime you give anybody in excess of any kind of hormone, or in excess of just about anything, the receptors for that substrate, for that chemical that you're giving, those receptors start decreasing because your body's a very efficient machine. This is how people end up with diabetes, right? It's their insulin sensitivity goes down. The number of insulin receptors go away because there's so much glucose around all the time.
They're overtaxed.
Right, they're just overtaxed. And so now they have all this glucose, which leads to all this insulin. And so there's just so much insulin around all the time, your body just doesn't produce as many receptors. And the same thing happens with testosterone. So if I give somebody 200 milligrams, well, their blood's going to see for a couple of days like a super physiologic, way more than they could ever produce. And it's going to be saturating all these receptors. And your body's going to be like, well, I don't need to make all these receptors. There's all this testosterone around. I only need one receptor to get all I need. I don't need to produce 100 of them. So now you start down-regulating the number of receptors that you have.
Oh.
And so you're super high for a couple of days. And after you've done this for several months, maybe 6 months, probably your testicles aren't producing any significant amount of testosterone. So you're dependent 100% on the shot. So you're giving yourself this shot, and you're going way higher than you should be for a couple of days. Then you're going down in the next couple of days to probably about where you should be. And then you're going down after that a couple of days to lower than you should be. And then you give yourself another shot. And then you give yourself these big sinusoidal curves like this. Well, if you decrease all the androgen receptors, and I give you this huge bolus, now you have 300% more testosterone than you would ordinarily have.
Right.
But your receptors are down to a third. Well, now you're normal.
It's
for
1 to 1.
the first 2
For
days.
the first little bit.
And then the next 2 days you're low. And the next 2 days you're even lower.
Diminishing returns.
And then and this is why people start at these clinics. Like we were saying at the very beginning, they start at these clinics, go, I feel so much better. And then it kind of plateaus, and it kind of like gets a little worse over time. They're like, yeah, I guess I feel better. And then it's not any kind of sensation. But if they go off of it, whoa, they're so screwed now, right? Because now if they go off of it, even if they could get the testosterone production that they had before, which is unlikely, but if they could get their testicular function right back to where it was, if they only have a third of the receptors, they're only essentially getting 30% of what they started with. So now they're way worse off, and they're just going to stay on it forever. And I mean, I counsel my patients very heavily that if you want to go on testosterone replacement therapy, you're making a lifestyle commitment to basically the rest of your
For
life.
A long time.
You're going to do this. As long as you want to feel healthy and good, I mean, you're going to have to do this. Once you start on this, it's almost impossible to come off. So the vast majority of my clients have already exhausted everything else before they get on hormone replacement therapy.
Right.
So like we started with over-the-counter supplements, and we got them up there and maybe held them there for 5 years, and then that wasn't working. And then I started giving them, things like clomiphene, which will cause your body to produce more testosterone, or HCG that will cause your testicles to make more testosterone. And then you give them a pharmaceutical to block the production of estrogen, and so they have more testosterone. And so now that we can do another 5 or 10 years, we can keep them up there without that. And now maybe they're 50, 55, 60, and they're like, this just isn't working for me anymore. And all right, now that's the time to go on testosterone replacement therapy. But I have my clients do an injection every other day to try to reduce that huge spike.
Small injections.
So they're only taking like 120 milligrams over the course of a week, which is physiologically normal, but they're doing 30 milligrams every other day.
Gotcha.
30 to 40 depending on the person, but so it's somewhere right around 100 milligrams a week. And with that, that will get people into that, usually the upper 10% of the reference range. And once you're up in that upper range, and I'm monitoring their estrogen and making sure that's not going up, and I'm monitoring their DHT and making sure that's not going up, and I'm monitoring their DHEA and making sure that they're still making all the precursors on the way to testosterone that are metabolically active. And now I've got the whole thing covered. And after a year of that, and people completely transform themselves, and they're feeling better every day for a year.
And how often are you checking the blood?
When I first start, if somebody's complex, I would maybe do every month for 3 or 4 months. But most of my clients, I get are really healthy people. And so I usually just give them about a month. I'll test them after a month and make sure that we're in the ballpark, and we might adjust it slightly. And then I'll test them quarterly for the first year, and then every 6 months for the remainder of the time they're with me.
Give me a little bit about over-the-counter supplements. I mean, we see them advertised all the time on television. Every time you open up a magazine on a plane or something, there's advertisements for over-the-counter T-boosters, whatever, accelerators. There's all sorts. Are they dangerous?
The chemicals, the supplement themselves, most likely are not dangerous. Being a guy who owns a supplement company, I can speak with some experience as to how the supplement industry works. And so when you look at things like that you would find in a bodybuilding type magazine, regardless of how many company names you see in there, by and large, there's like 3 or 4 companies doing all of that.
Everything's white labeled.
Well, not even that. They're producing a product that's maybe slippery to produce, and then as soon as the FDA starts cracking down on that, they implode that company and they start another company. It's all the same people, and it's the next substrate, the next precursor to testosterone, the next possible adaptogen or secretagogue, and like they just keep finding, and there's a million. It's just an infinite game of cat and mouse, because there's so many things that affect your physiology and the way they want it to. They're just going to keep coming out with new compounds. Unfortunately, that doesn't show a whole lot of ethical responsibility, right? And so those companies also tend to buy really crappy ingredients. So they buy stuff from China, which a lot of the supplements come from China, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're bad, but you have to really test those. And what usually happens is they test them for, does it have the compound that it's supposed to have in there? They don't test it for, does it have heavy metals in it? Does it have arsenic? Does it have how many pollutants and endocrine disruptors does it have? Most people don't test for that unless they're a pretty high-end supplement company, or just a really ethical small company.
Right.
So if you have, a company that's just reproducing the next subsidiary of Fly By Night Industries every, 6 months, I wouldn't trust that very much. So the shorter answer is if you can find something from, Thorne or some big company like that you can think of, like
that's reputable, that's been around a long time.
Yeah, that's been around for a long time.
That's not playing that cat and mouse game.
If they have something that's postulated to affect your testosterone level, I would say try that. If it really worked, it would probably be a drug. To be honest,
yeah.
it'd probably be a controlled substance if it worked really well. I mean, I'm not saying that it wouldn't work at all.
That's the FDA's job.
Right. It's the FDA's job to say, well, that's actually a drug at this point, right? And they can assign drug status to stuff that shouldn't be drugs, and I'm not a big fan of their games either. But if you go to something like Natural Sources or or Thorne or even the Life Extension brand, like all these people that have been around for 30 or 40 years, and they are very reputable. I would say it's worth trying, but I wouldn't base it on how you feel just because of the placebo effect. I would get labs and go in there. Like if you're trying to boost your testosterone, go see what your testosterone is.
Yes.
And then take your supplements for a month and then go see what it is again. And if there's no change, believe that. Just say, okay, well, I got marketed. And, their marketers are brilliant. They're very good at convincing you stuff that they want you to believe.
Last one, because I know a lot of people want to know this. To do it right, is it expensive?
No. The doctor's time might be expensive depending on who you go to.
Okay.
But the supplement or the hormones themselves, I mean, I want to say a vial of testosterone, which would be, 2,000 milligrams in a vial, 200 milligrams per ml. So 2,000 milligrams in a vial, if you're taking 100 milligrams a week, it's every 2 weeks is 200. So it'd be 20 weeks. And that's like, a couple $100 for a vial of testosterone. The aromatase inhibitors are maybe $1 a week, $2 a week, something like that. DHEA is an over-the-counter supplement. If you end up needing something to block your conversion to DHT, that if you're a man, that's going to be covered under insurance if you have insurance anyway. But it's an off-patent drug, finasteride. Same thing people use for hair loss and whatever.
Right.
It's the same drug. And that's dirt cheap as well. I mean, you could literally do it for the cost of the pharmaceuticals are probably significantly less than $200 a month, maybe less than $100 a month.
Where can people learn more about you and Sleep Remedy?
DocParsley.com.
Doc Parsley, thanks so much. That was awesome.
All right, thanks.